Alrighty, everybody. So it's time for the Young and the Restless storyline of 1976. So there was never a year more in tune with the biblical verse, to everything there's a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. Phillip Chancellor III was born. Bill Foster died. Jenny, Peggy, and Joanne wept. Liz mourned. Lorie, Lance, Leslie, and Brad loved. Katherine and Jill continued to wage war. Snapper healed, and Stuart was restored to health. And Brock sowed seeds of hope, love, and peace through acts of human kindness. The Chancellor baby had to remain in the hospital several days after his birth because of high fevers. During this time, Kay constantly bugged Jill over the deal they had made that she would raise the child as her own in exchange for the sum of $1 million. It was a deal that only Kay's son, Brock, and the Fosters violently opposed. Kay was also firming up her plans to leave the Chancellor estate to the senior citizens. She intended to leave Genoa City and the life she knew there to establish a new life for herself and the baby. But when Jill held her son in her arms for the first time, she realized she couldn't go through with it. She bolted from the hospital with the baby, leaving a thunderstruck Kay behind. Not one to take things lying down, Kay created a mighty ruckus with the Fosters, who had returned her check. Kay headed straight for her attorney's office to initiate proceedings to repossess the baby. Her attorney advised her to drop the suit. Fuming, her next step was to kick out the seniors from her estate. Kay then returned to her drinking. Brock, the eternal optimist, attempted to persuade her to make something of her life by helping the Fosters in their time of dire financial need. Meanwhile, Jill was instituting a lawsuit of her own on behalf of her son for one half of Phillip Chancellor's estate. She also hawked her jewelry in an effort to get her parents to go to Arizona, where the climate would be better for her father's emphysema. Liz, meanwhile, begged Kay to hire her as a housekeeper, but failed to tell Jill about it. Then Kay, feeling good about doing good, decided to accept Brock's challenge to come to the Fosters' aid. She was just about to set up a trust fund for Phillip when she was served with Jill's petition to recover her son's rightful share of the estate. Deeply hurt and feeling very much the fool, Kay nevertheless swallowed her pride and agreed to a meeting with Jill to iron things out. She'd drop her lawsuit, Jill said, if Kay would be willing to help her out her family. But unfortunately, their amiable sparring completely fell apart when declarations of mistrust were hurled back and forth. Katherine decided that she didn't believe Phillip Chancellor was the father of Jill's baby, which sent Jill out into the night, half screaming and half sobbing. The courts would have to settle their dispute after all. Jill's petition in probate court against the estate was a total bust, as there was nothing in writing to substantiate her claims. Even though Brock testified against his mother, admitting that she had offered him money to marry the then-pregnant Jill, and his testimony did Kay a great deal of harm, the judge nevertheless decided in Kay's favor, leading Brock to proclaim she was now truly alone with only the memory of her dead husband to sustain her. Jill, of course, vowed to get even. Her first move was to call upon Katherine, badger her into admitting Phillip did indeed love her, and that the son she bore was Phillip's. She then left, leaving behind a bag that contained a bottle of vodka. Her plan was to destroy Kay by pretending that things were as before. Phillip was still alive, there was no baby, and Kay was a hopeless drunk. Jill had cases of vodka delivered to gaslight her, and poor Liz, who was employed as a domestic at the estate, could hardly believe her daughter could be so devious. Even Brock was flabbergasted as to the extent Jill was taking this to drive Kay insane. He led his mother to Phillip's tombstone. He was buried on the estate, to show her that Jill's machinations to make her believe Phillip were still alive were utterly false. When Bill Foster returned home to spend the final months of his life with his family, he vowed he would be as unobtrusive as possible. But he didn't want to be so unobtrusive that he would let another man propose to his wife and take her away from him. Bill proposed to, and Liz accepted. They renewed their vows. It was a strong, quiet kind of love that Liz had for Bill, a love that he returned in kind. When hospital treatment for Bill's lung cancer and emphysema became too costly, Bill turned to smoking with the intention of hastening his death until Snapper and Liz put a stop to it. He insisted on being an organ donor and signed a DNR, do not resuscitate, order as well. Bill quietly wrote a letter a year up to his 21st birthday to little Phillip, as well as a letter he wanted to be delivered to Kay after his death, thanking her for agreeing to pay for his hospitalization. He asked Jill to prepare Liz for the end, knowing how hard their mother would take it, and he asked Brock to deliver his eulogy. Just when Bill thought he might go home one last time, he suffered a serious lapse and was put on a life support ventilator. When he regained consciousness, he was in such acute pain that he begged Liz to pull the plug. This went against everything she would ever do, against her God, against herself, against her sense of justice and humanity. But she did as Bill asked, as an act of love, and watched as his contorted face relaxed in a peaceful sleep. Lorie Brooks dreaded the arrival of New Year's Eve. It was the day she had hoped to marry Mark Henderson. She confessed to Brock that her new philosophy was, from now on, I think of myself first, to hell with the rest of the world, and all men are now fair game. It was her brother-in-law, Brad, who put the pieces of the puzzle together. He knew that Lorie had taken a blood test at Mark's request. Then there had been that disturbing conversation between Mark and Jennifer, and then Mark's distraught words to Lorie. Lorie overheard the tail end of a disturbing conversation between Brad and her mother, and she demanded to know that Brad tell her what it was all about. Lorie knew it was more than just the mastectomy that was sinking her mother into an emotional morass. It had to have something to do with Mark's refusal to marry her. And in a flash, Lorie, too, had come up with the answer. Why hadn't she seen it before? Mark was her brother. Lorie tore into Jennifer not only for the loss of Mark, but also for the loss of Stuart, the only real father she had ever known. When Lorie later faced Stuart for the first time after her revelation, he sensed there was something troubling his second child and reached out to comfort her. She bolted from his arms. Later, unwilling and unable to walk away from Mark unless she gave it one more try, Lorie located him in a clinic on the outskirts of Cleveland and proposed they resume their relationship. Mark sadly told her that it wouldn't work. It was contrary to the laws of man and God. It had to be goodbye. Lorie left promising Mark she would never trouble him again. In Paris, where she was performing, Leslie ran into her old friend Lance Prentice and invited him to visit her in the States. Side note, for those of you who watched The Bold and the Beautiful, Lance at that time was played by John McCook, who you guys on Bold and Beautiful know as Eric Forrester. So, Leslie wanted him to meet her husband Brad and sister Lorie. Leslie intrigued him by saying that she knew Lorie and he would be incredible together. So what began in an unremarkable enough way, with Lorie and Lance sizing each other up and sparring with one another at a bar in Chicago, turned out to be a remarkable love affair punctuated by their pursuit of exotic adventures all over the world, which each of them an equal partner in a thrilling game of creating desire and longing, chasing to be caught, teasing and being teased, romancing, and then refraining from the ultimate act. It was a dangerous game of the heart and mind they were playing until they finally realized they had reached the point of no return in their relationship and had fallen madly and irrevocably in love. For Lorie, it was the perfect cure for getting over Mark Henderson. For Lance, it brought into sharp focus a new complication he had created by having two women in the center of his life, the headstrong, independent Lorie and his possessive mother, the veiled Vanessa. Vanessa Prentice was a woman of mystery. As half owner of Prentice Industries, she also made half of the decisions. The veil she wore across the lower part of her face covered the awful disfigurement she suffered when she saved her son Lance in a fire accidentally started years ago by her other son, Lucas. From that point on, Lance would belong to no one but her. Her dislike for Lorie was as undisguised as it was unreasonable, and Vanessa would fight tooth and nail to break up the couple. When Lance and Lorie married on the spur of the moment at Lake Tahoe, one might say it was done in part to best Vanessa. Brad Elliott loved his wife Leslie so much he couldn't bear the thought of burdening her with the reality that he was going blind. The news would only interfere with her career, so he simply didn't tell her he would soon lose his eyesight. He spun a web of lies to explain why he couldn't be with her at her concert sites or at a family celebration. And the more he lied, the more entangled he became in his deceitful web until it was impossible to extricate himself. He would rather, she thought, he didn't love her than deny her the triumphs and acclaim she was winning. But as far as she was concerned, her success meant nothing without Brad. Soon, he asked for a divorce, but when he found out that she was pregnant with his child, he was stunned and overwhelmed. He learned to read Braille, and when Lorie told her sister the truth, Leslie wrote him a letter in Braille telling him how much she loved him. It was the beginning of breaking through his defenses. Although Jennifer's 4 daughters resented her betrayal of Stuart, the youngest, Peggy, was the most reluctant to forgive her. It was understandable then that Peggy should seek someone to whom she could unburden her soul. Peggy certainly couldn't discuss this with her father, who was still in the dark, although he was becoming more aware of certain enigmatic tensions. Peggy turned to her tutor because Jack Curtis was easy to talk to, and he seemed to give her the kind of advice that led her to believe he had her best interests at heart. So Peggy found herself consulting with him frequently, unaware that he was altering his own personal schedule to accommodate her. It seems that his wife Joanne, a waitress at the Allegro, was desperately trying to lose weight, get it under control to please him, and put the romance back in their marriage. She had lost 8 pounds, but had many more to go. Brock was encouraging Joanne and gave her some money to buy a new dress so she would look nice for Jack when they went out that night. But later Jack called her to say he had to go to a meeting. He was meeting Peggy at the library, and he would be late. Too late. When Jack returned home, he said he was too tired to do anything but go straight to bed. Forget dinner, forget the movies. Then Joanne tried to initiate lovemaking, but he was not interested. Bitterly disappointed, Joanne assuaged her frustrations by devouring the entire dinner she had prepared. Diet be damned. On campus, rumors were flying that Professor Jack Curtis traded grades for sexual favors, and Peggy confronted Jack about them. Jack said he was glad she brought up the subject, but that she shouldn't add to their credence by falling in love with him. Peggy said it might already be too late. Meanwhile, back at the Allegro, Brock was trying to cheer up Joanne. It was her birthday, and she thought Jack had forgotten it. Actually, Jack remembered it while he was out with Peggy. He cut their date short and rushed off to buy Joanne a gift before going home. Months passed. Neither Joanne nor Peggy was aware of what Jack was doing. Each thought she was the woman in Jack's life. When they found out he was leading both of them on, they were outraged. Joanne had been working so hard to make herself attractive to Jack that she was gradually becoming a much more self-assured young lady. That Jack was cheating on her was more than she was willing to accept. She demanded that he remove all of his things from their apartment and get out, go after Peggy if he wanted her. Chris Foster first encountered the Becker family through legal aid when Nancy, a diabetic, sought advice for her husband Ron, who was being held in jail on a possible rape and burglary charge. Nancy insisted Ron was completely innocent and that the charge was the result of a setup by a woman whom Ron had shunned. Disbelieving Ron's story and believing her own shattering experience of being a rape victim, Chris was repulsed even by the sight of Ron. But her heart went out to Nancy and her little girl Karen. Ron was freed of this charge because of insufficient evidence. Foolishly, Chris asked her father to help find a job for Ron to help get the family back on its feet. Ron secured a job as a woodworker, and the compassionate Chris asked him to make a table for her. Peggy wanted to confide in somebody about Jack Curtis, so she went to Chris's apartment. When she found her sister wasn't home, Peggy let herself in with her key, intending to wait for Chris. An intruder got there first and raped her. Jack, meanwhile, was racing over to the Brookses to tell Peggy he was going to be free to marry her, but her family turned him away. Chris insisted that her sister report the assault to the police. Ron Becker had been arrested as a suspect, and Peggy identified him in a police lineup. A hearing was scheduled, and Ron asked his wife to have his work clothes cleaned for the hearing. Emptying his pockets, Nancy found a note with Chris's address on it and realized her husband did indeed know where Chris lived. Shattered, she began to doubt him. It turned out that the case did go to trial, but the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, concluding that Peggy's case was not proved beyond a reasonable doubt. The Beckers' home life became a shambles and was often punctuated by violent arguments. Nancy argued in favor of leaving Genoa City, but Ron, wanting to get even with the Brookses, wouldn't hear of it. One of Ron's verbal attacks was so vicious that Nancy fell into a catatonic state and had to be institutionalized. Ron then left town, and Chris and Snapper took little Karen in, becoming more and more attached to the enchanting little girl the longer they kept her. Jennifer went home at last, and her doctor pronounced that there was no evidence that her cancer had recurred. However, a previously undetected heart condition would take her life within the coming year, after she and Stuart celebrated their 30th anniversary and made peace with one another. As for Gwen Sherman, she was now Sister Magdalene. She was ready to take her final vows until Greg Foster walked into her life again. The Mother Superior, noting there were feelings that the young nun was trying to suppress, cautioned her not to go to God with half a heart, but to pray for guidance. It was certainly a year that tested the mettle of many. Perhaps next year would be more tranquil.